When JD Vance was turned away from a small-town diner because of his politics, he could have lashed out on social media, called for a boycott, or simply walked away angry. Instead, he did something so unexpected that it changed not just one restaurant, but an entire community. His response to rejection wasn't revenge, it was kindness. And in today's divided world, that was truly shocking. The story begins on an ordinary evening at Maple Creek Diner. JD Vance pulled his car into the gravel parking lot of Maple Creek Diner. The neon open sign buzzed in the window, casting a red glow over puddles from the afternoon rain. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and it was already 7 in the evening. The bell above the door jingled as JD stepped inside. The smell of fresh coffee and fried potatoes filled the air. Country music played softly from speakers in the ceiling. 6 tables were occupied with locals enjoying their dinner. A waitress with curly brown hair tied back in a ponytail looked up and smiled. "Sit anywhere you like," she called out, balancing 3 plates along her arm. Her name tag read, Talia. JD chose a small booth by the window and picked up the plastic menu. Everything looked good after a long day. The special was meatloaf with mashed potatoes. His grandmother used to make that on cold nights. The memory made him smile. Talia finished delivering her orders and walked over with a glass of water and a notepad. "Welcome to Maple Creek. Can I start you with some coffee?" "That would be great. Thank you," JD said, as Talia turned toward the coffee pot. A woman emerged from the kitchen. She wore an apron with Melissa embroidered on it and had flour on her hands. She froze when she saw JD. "Talia!" she called sharply. "Come here a minute." Talia looked confused but set down her notepad and walked over to Melissa. The 2 women whispered near the cash register. Talia's eyes widened, and she glanced back at JD. Melissa's face grew red as she talked. The other customers began to notice, and conversations quieted. Melissa straightened her apron and walked directly to JD's table, with Talia trailing behind. "I'm sorry, but I can't serve you here," Melissa said, her voice tight but clear. JD looked up, surprised. "I'm sorry?" "I know who you are, Mr. Vance. I don't agree with your politics, and I don't feel comfortable having you in my restaurant." She crossed her arms. "This is my place, and I get to decide who eats here." The diner went silent. Every customer turned to watch. A man at the counter set down his coffee cup with a loud clink. JD looked at Melissa for a long moment. Talia shifted from one foot to the other, clutching her notepad to her chest. She looked like she wanted to disappear. JD could feel his face growing warm. His first thought was to argue, to remind her that businesses shouldn't turn people away based on politics. He could make a scene. He could threaten to tell his followers online. Instead, he took a deep breath. "I understand," he said quietly. He folded his menu and placed it back in its holder. "It's your business, your choice." Melissa seemed surprised by his calm response. She had braced herself for an argument. "Thank you for your honesty," JD added, sliding out of the booth. "Have a good evening." He walked toward the door, feeling every eye in the place watching him. The bell jingled again as he stepped outside into the cool evening air. Back in his car, JD sat with his hands on the steering wheel. His stomach still growled, but now he felt a weight on his chest, too. He wasn't a stranger to rejection. His whole life had been about facing hard truths and finding ways forward. Through the window, he could see Melissa talking to the customers, her hands moving quickly as she explained. Some people nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Talia stood by the coffee pot, staring at her shoes. JD reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He found the number he was looking for and pressed call. It rang 3 times before a voice answered. "Hey, it's JD. Remember that thing we talked about last month? I think I found the perfect place." He looked back at the diner, with its warms, golden lights against the darkening sky. "Yeah, tomorrow works. I'll send you the details." JD smiled slightly. "Trust me, this is going to surprise everyone." He hung up and started his car. The radio came on, playing an old Johnny Cash song. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he didn't feel angry anymore. He felt something else, something like hope. Talia watched JD's car disappear down the road. The diner slowly returned to normal, but she couldn't shake the knot in her stomach. "Can you believe it?" Melissa said, coming to stand beside her. "He just walked out. No fuss." "Did we have to do that?" Talia asked quietly. "He was just trying to eat dinner." Melissa's face hardened. "My parents lost their farm because of policies he supports. I can't serve someone like that and feel right about it." Talia nodded but didn't reply. The bell above the door jingled as a family of 4 entered. Melissa went to greet them, her smile back in place. For the rest of her shift, Talia took orders and delivered food. But her mind kept returning to JD's face when Melissa turned him away. He hadn't looked angry. He'd looked sad. As she wiped down the last table at closing time, Talia wondered what JD had done after leaving. Probably found another restaurant. Probably told people online about mean Melissa and her little diner. Tomorrow would be just another day at Maple Creek. Or so she thought. She had no idea what was coming next. Talia's feet ached as she walked up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment. The elevator had been broken for months, and the landlord kept saying he'd fix it next week. She'd stopped believing him after the 4th next week came and went. The hallway smelled like someone's burnt dinner. Talia dug in her purse for her keys, trying not to make noise. It was almost midnight, and her grandmother would be sleeping. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped into the dark living room. A small lamp clicked on. "You're late," said a soft voice. Eliza Reynolds sat in her faded blue armchair, a crocheted blanket over her legs. Her silver hair was tied in a loose braid, and her reading glasses hung on a chain around her neck. "Sorry, Grandma. Melissa asked me to stay and help with inventory." Talia set her purse on the kitchen counter. "Why are you still up? Did you take your medicine?" Eliza waved away the question. "Of course I did. I'm not a child." She patted the couch beside her chair. "Come sit. You look troubled." Talia kicked off her shoes and sank into the couch. She never could hide anything from her grandmother. Eliza had raised her since she was 8, after Talia's parents died in a car crash. Eliza could read her like a book. "Something happened at the diner today," Talia began. She told Eliza about JD Vance coming in and Melissa refusing to serve him. She just told him to leave in front of everyone? Eliza frowned. "Yeah, and the weird thing is, he didn't get mad. He just said okay and left." Talia leaned her head back against the couch. "I felt awful, Grandma. Like we did something wrong." "Maybe you did," Eliza said quietly. Talia looked at her grandmother in surprise. Eliza rarely criticized anyone. "Melissa has her reasons, I'm sure," Eliza continued, "but turning someone away because you disagree with them." She shook her head. "That's not the way I raised you." "What was I supposed to do? Melissa's the boss. I need this job." Talia's voice cracked. "Your medicine costs so much, and the rent went up again." Eliza reached out and patted Talia's hand. "Don't you worry about me. We've been through worse." But Talia did worry. every day. Eliza's heart condition required expensive medication. Without insurance, they barely made ends meet. The diner job wasn't great, but it was the only place in town that would work around Talia's community college schedule. Melissa seemed so upset, Talia said. The diner's not doing well. She told me last week that if business doesn't pick up, she might have to cut hours. That would be hard on everyone, Eliza agreed. She glanced at the stack of bills on the side table. What do you think JD will do? Talia asked. Will he tell people online not to eat at Maple Creek? Who knows? Eliza pulled her blanket higher. People surprise you sometimes. I just hope he doesn't make trouble. Melissa can be stubborn, but she's not a bad person. Her family's been through a lot. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Everyone has a story, Talia. Everyone has reasons for what they do. She looked out the window at the streetlight flickering outside. Sometimes the kindest people are the ones who've known the most pain. Talia wasn't sure if her grandmother was talking about Melissa or JD or someone else entirely. Eliza often spoke in riddles that made sense only later. I should get to bed, Talia said, standing up. Morning shift tomorrow. She leaned down to kiss her grandmother's cheek. You too, okay? You need your rest. Eliza caught Talia's hand. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember to be kind. That's the only thing that matters in the end. Something in her grandmother's voice made Talia pause. Do you know something I don't? Eliza smiled mysteriously. I'm just an old woman with old thoughts. Go to bed. Talia helped her grandmother to her bedroom and made sure she had water and her morning pills ready. Then she went to her own tiny room and changed into her pajamas. As she lay in bed, Talia couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. JD's calm face when he left the diner, the phone call he made in his car, Melissa's worried looks at the account books. Talia pulled the blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it. She always did. She fell asleep thinking of JD Vance's words. Thank you for your honesty. Such a strange thing to say to someone who had just kicked you out. Talia's alarm blared at 5:30 a.m. She groaned and slapped at her phone, knocking it to the floor. The beeping continued until she rolled out of bed to silence it. She hated morning shifts, but they paid an extra $1 per hour. She showered quickly and checked on Eliza, who was still sleeping peacefully. Talia left a note on the kitchen counter. Lunch in the fridge. Call if you need anything. Love you. The morning was chilly. Talia zipped her jacket all the way up and walked briskly toward Main Street. The sun was just starting to lighten the IU sky, turning the clouds pink and gold. When she rounded the corner to Maple Creek Diner, Talia stopped in her tracks. A crowd of at least 30 people stood outside the restaurant. Her first thought was protesters. Had JD Vance sent people to picket the diner? Her stomach dropped. As she got closer, though, she realized something was off. The people weren't carrying signs. They were just waiting. Some held coffee cups from the gas station down the street. Others chatted in small groups. An older man checked his watch. Excuse me, Talia said, pushing through to the front door. I work here. What's going on? Woman in a red coat smiled at her. We're waiting for you to open. Is it true JD Vance recommended this place? Talia blinked in confusion. What? No, that's not. He did. I saw his post, a man interrupted. Said it had the best home cooking in the county. Before Talia could respond, a news van pulled up. A tall man with styled hair and a microphone jumped out, followed by a camera operator. Perfect timing, the reporter said, spotting Talia. Do you work here? I'm Camden Walsh from Channel 8 News. Can we get a statement about the social media sensation? I don't know what you're talking about, Talia said honestly. She fumbled, with her keys unlocking the door. I need to open up. Just a quick interview? Camden pressed. Sorry, I can't be late. Talia slipped inside and quickly locked the door behind her. The diner was dark except for the lights Melissa always left on in the kitchen. Talia flipped the main switches, and the familiar buzz of fluorescent lights filled the silence. She hung up her jacket and tied on her apron, trying to make sense of what was happening. She checked her phone. 3 missed calls from Melissa. She was about to call back when the back door banged open. Talia! Thank goodness! Melissa rushed in, her face flushed. She wore no makeup, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail instead of her usual neat bun. Have you seen what's happening? There's a crowd outside. Something about JD Vance recommending us online? It's insane! Melissa pulled out her phone and thrust it at Talia. Look, on the screen was a social media post from JD Vance. It included a picture of Maple Creek Diner from the outside, with its charming blue awning and window boxes. The text read, "Was turned away from this little gem in Oakwood last night because the owner didn't agree with my politics. Respect her right to refuse service. But trust me, folks, their meatloaf special smelled amazing, and everyone inside looked happy. Small businesses are the heart of America, even when they don't want my business. If you're in the area, give Maple Creek Diner a try and form your own opinion. Support local, always." Talia looked up at Melissa in shock. He's sending people to eat here after you kicked him out? It doesn't make sense, Melissa said, taking back her phone. Is this some kind of trick? Is he trying to make me look bad? That doesn't sound like a trick to me, Talia said slowly. It sounds like forgiveness, Melissa snorted. Nobody's that nice, especially not politicians. The front door rattled as someone knocked. Camden, the reporter, waved through the glass, pointing at his watch. We're not open for 20 more minutes, Melissa called. I just want a quick statement about the viral post, Camden shouted back. Viral? Melissa echoed. She looked pale. We'd better start cooking, Talia said practically. All those people will want breakfast. For the next 15 minutes, they prepared in a rush. Melissa called the other waitress, Danny, to come in early. They brewed extra coffee and mixed double batches of pancake batter. Talia turned on all 4 grills instead of the usual 2. At exactly 6:30 a.m., Melissa unlocked the front door. People streamed in, filling every table and booth within minutes. Camden and his camera operator set up in a corner. Please, just one. Statement, Camden begged, following Melissa as she delivered menus. What's your response to JD Vance's post? No comment, Melissa said tersely. Unless you're ordering breakfast, Camden smiled. Fine, I'll have the pancake special. By 7 a.m., they had a waiting list. Melissa had to call in their part-time cook, Hector, who normally worked only lunch shifts. The kitchen was a blur of activity. Every time the bell on the door jingled, Talia looked up, half expecting to see JD walk in. During a rare, quiet moment, Talia found Melissa standing by the window, watching the crowd outside. We'll run out of food at this rate, Melissa said quietly. I've never seen it this busy, not even on Christmas morning. Isn't this good? Talia asked. I don't know what it is. Melissa looked troubled. Why would he do this? I insulted him. I threw him out of my restaurant. Maybe he's just being nice. Nobody's that nice, Melissa repeated, but with less certainty. That bell jingled again. An elderly couple entered, looking around in wonder at the packed diner. Is this where that nice JD Vance got turned away? The woman asked loudly. He said we should come support you anyway. Isn't that something? Melissa's face flushed. She nodded without speaking and led them to a newly cleaned table. Talia watched her boss throughout the morning. Melissa's movements were stiff, her smile forced. Every time someone mentioned JD's name, she flinched slightly. By lunchtime, the news vans from 3 different stations were parked outside. The story was spreading. The diner that had refused to serve JD Vance was now the most popular restaurant in the county because of JD himself. After the lunch rush, Melissa disappeared into her tiny office and shut the door. When Talia brought her a cup of coffee 10 minutes later, she found her boss sitting at her desk, crying silently. "I don't understand," Melissa whispered. Why didn't he fight back? Talia had no answer for Melissa. She set the coffee cup on the desk and stepped back, unsure what to say to her boss. "Maybe he's just a nice person," she offered finally. Melissa wiped her eyes with a napkin. "Nobody is that nice, especially not in politics." She sighed and straightened her shoulders. "We should get back out there. The dinner crowd will start soon." For the rest of the week, Maple Creek Diner stayed busy from open until close. Melissa had to call suppliers twice to get extra deliveries. She hired 2 new waitresses and another cook. The cash register filled up so fast that she had to make bank runs in the middle of the day. On Friday afternoon, Talia overheard 2 customers talking while she refilled their coffee. "It's got to be a trick," said a man in a work uniform. "He's making her look bad. All these people coming here, they're just waiting for her to mess up." "I don't think so," his friend argued. "My cousin knows JD's assistant. Says he's actually a decent guy in person. Maybe he meant what he said about supporting local business." "Politicians don't do nice things for no reason," the first man insisted. Talia moved on to the next table. But similar conversations echoed throughout the diner all day. Some people thought JD was setting a trap. Others believed he was being genuinely kind. Nobody seemed to agree. During her break, Talia checked her phone. The story had spread beyond their small town. National news sites had picked it up. JD Vance responds to restaurant rejection with kindness, read one headline. Another said, "Political divide. Restaurant owner refuses service to JD Vance." There were pictures of the diner everywhere. People online argued about Melissa's right to turn JD away. Others praised JD for his peaceful response. Some called for boycotts. Others planned road trips just to eat at the now famous diner. Talia felt dizzy looking at it all. Their little diner had become a symbol in some larger fight that had nothing to do with meatloaf or coffee. When she got home that night, Eliza was watching the local news. Camden Walsh stood outside Maple Creek Diner, talking into his microphone. The owner, Melissa Hargrove, has declined to comment further on why she refused service to JD Vance, he was saying. But sources say she has personal reasons for her political views. Talia grabbed the remote and turned off the TV. "Hey, I was watching that," Eliza protested. "It's all lies," Talia said, dropping onto the couch. "They don't know anything about Melissa or why she did what she did." Eliza studied her granddaughter's face. "You look exhausted, dear." "I am. The diner's been packed all week. My feet are killing me." Talia rubbed her eyes. "But Melissa looks worse. She barely sleeps. She jumps every time the door opens, like she's expecting JD to walk in." "Is she sorry for what she did?" Talia thought about it. "I don't know. She's confused. We all are." She looked at her grandmother. "What would you have done if someone you disagreed with strongly came into your business?" Eliza was quiet for a moment. "When I was young, your grandfather and I ran a small grocery store. Times were different then. There were people who didn't want us to serve certain customers because of the color of their skin. Talia nodded. She'd heard stories about those days. We decided that our store would serve everyone, not because we agreed with everyone, but because we believed people should be judged by how they treat others, not by who they are or what they believe. Eliza reached for Talia's hand. But it wasn't easy. We lost friends. We got threats. This feels different, Talia said. Is it? Eliza asked gently. Turning someone away is a serious thing. It says, "You're not welcome here." That's a heavy message to give anyone. Talia had no response. She helped her grandmother to bed and then checked her phone one more time before sleeping. JD Vance had made no new comments about the diner. Just that one post, sending people their way. The next morning, Talia arrived early again. The crowd outside was smaller but still impressive for a Saturday at 6 a.m. Inside, she found Melissa already cooking. Dark circles hung under her eyes. "You're early," Talia said, tying on her apron. "Couldn't sleep." Melissa flipped pancakes with quick, sharp movements. "The bank called yesterday. They want to meet about a loan I applied for last month. Suddenly, I'm a good risk." She laughed without humor. "1 week of good business and everyone thinks I'm a success. Isn't that good news?" Melissa's hands stilled on the spatula. "Is it? I kicked a man out of my restaurant because I didn't like his politics. He responded by sending me more business than I've had in 3 years." She looked at Talia, her eyes red-rimmed. "What does that make me?" Before Talia could answer, they heard a commotion at the front door. The early customers were getting impatient. "Let's talk later," Melissa said, turning back to the grill. "After the lunch rush, I need to make a decision about all this." "What kind of decision?" Talia asked. But Melissa just shook her head and kept cooking, her face troubled and tired. A week after JD Vance's post, Maple Creek Diner was still the busiest restaurant in town. The initial rush had calmed a little, but they were serving twice as many customers as before. Melissa had to order new menus with slightly higher prices to cover the extra staff she'd hired. The morning was foggy as Talia arrived for her shift. She didn't have to be there until 9, but she'd promised to help sort through deliveries. The mailman was just leaving as she walked up. "Morning, Talia," he said cheerfully. "Got quite a stack for Melissa today. Seems everyone wants to write to the famous diner lady." Talia nodded politely and took the bundle of mail. Since the story broke, Melissa had received letters from all over the country. Some supported her decision to turn JD away. Others called her names that made Talia's ears burn. Melissa had stopped opening them after the 3rd day. Inside, Talia sorted the mail into the usual piles: bills, business letters, and what Melissa called opinion mail. That last pile went straight into a box under the counter to be dealt with someday. An envelope in the middle of the stack caught Talia's eye. It was cream-colored and heavier than the others. The handwriting on the front was neat and slanted slightly to the right. There was no return address, just Melissa Hargrove, and the diner's address. Talia set it aside, separate from the opinion mail. Something about it seemed important. The morning passed in a blur of pancakes and coffee refills. Around 11, when the breakfast crowd thinned and before the lunch rush began, Talia remembered the cream envelope. There was something different. "In the mail today," she told Melissa, pulling the envelope from her apron pocket. "I thought you might want to see it." Melissa looked up from the schedule she was making. "If it's another person telling me I'm what's wrong with America, I'll pass. I don't think that's what it is." Talia handed her the envelope. "The handwriting seems personal." Melissa took it with a sigh. She turned it over in her hands, running her finger along the edge. "Fine. I'll look at it later." But she didn't put it in the opinion box. Instead, She slipped it into her pocket and went back to the schedule. Talia didn't see the envelope again until closing time. She was wiping down tables when she noticed Melissa sitting alone in a corner booth, the cream envelope open in front of her. Melissa's face was very still as she read, one hand pressed against her mouth. Not wanting to intrude, Talia continued cleaning. But when she glanced over again, Melissa was still in the same position, staring at the letter. "Everything okay?" Talia asked quietly. Melissa looked up, startled. "What? Oh, yes." She carefully folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. "Actually, no. I don't know." She shook her head. "It's from him. From JD Vance." Talia stopped, wiping. "What does it say?" "That's just it," Melissa said slowly. "It's not what I expected at all." Before she could explain further, Hector called from the kitchen that he was finished cleaning and ready to leave. The moment passed. Melissa tucked the letter into her pocket again and went to lock up. The next day was Sunday, and the diner was closed. Talia spent the morning helping Eliza with laundry and grocery shopping. They were putting away canned goods when Talia's phone rang. It was Melissa. "Can you come to the diner at 4?" Melissa asked without greeting. "I'm calling a staff meeting." "Is something wrong?" Talia asked, worried. Business had been good. Surely Melissa wasn't cutting hours now. "No, nothing wrong. I just need to talk to everyone." Melissa sounded different, calmer somehow. "It's important." At 4 o'clock, Talia joined the rest of the staff at the diner. Everyone was there. Danny and the 2 new waitresses, Hector and the other cooks, even old Mr. Jenkins, who washed dishes on weekends. They sat at the pushed-together tables in the center of the restaurant, sipping coffee and speculating about the meeting. "Maybe she's selling the place," Danny whispered. "All this attention would drive up the price." "Or expanding," suggested one of the new waitresses. "My cousin's restaurant in Cleveland got famous from a celebrity visit, and they opened 3 new locations." The bell above the door jingled, and Melissa walked in. She'd done her hair differently, softer around her face. She wore a blue dress instead of her usual jeans and t-shirt. "Thank you all for coming," she said, standing at the head of the tables. "I know it's your day off." She took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this week about the diner, about all of you, and about what happened with JD Vance." Everyone got quiet. No one had dared to bring up the incident directly with Melissa until now. "I received a letter from him," Melissa continued. She pulled the cream envelope from her purse. "I'd like to read it to you, if that's okay." No one objected. Melissa unfolded the letter, smoothed it with her hands, and began to read. "Dear Ms. Hargrove," her voice was steady. "First, I want to thank you for your honesty when I came to your diner. In a world where people often hide their true feelings, your directness was refreshing." Melissa paused and took a breath before continuing. "My grandmother taught me that when someone rejects you, the best response is kindness. Not because it makes you look good, but because it recognizes that everyone has reasons for their actions, reasons we might not understand." Talia glanced around the room. Everyone was listening intently. Even Mr. Jenkins had stopped fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I didn't recommend your diner to embarrass you," Melissa read on. "I did it because even from my brief visit, I could see that Maple Creek Diner is special. The way your staff looked at you, the smell of real home cooking, the pictures of local kids on your bulletin board. These things matter. These are the places that hold communities together." Melissa's voice wavered slightly. "My politics come from wanting to help struggling communities like yours. We may disagree on the methods, but I believe we want the same things: for people to have good jobs, safe neighborhoods, and hope for their children's futures." She looked up briefly, then back to the letter. I don't ask you to change your mind about me or to serve me if I come back. That's your right as a business owner. I just ask that you keep doing what you're doing, serving good food and providing a place where your town can come together. That matters more than any political disagreement. Melissa lowered the letter. He signed it simply, JD. She looked around at her staff, her hands trembling slightly. I've been unfair. I judged him without knowing him. And when he had every reason to be angry, he chose to be kind instead. The room was silent. Talia felt a lump in her throat. So, Melissa said, straightening her shoulders, I've made a decision, and I wanted all of you to hear it first. Melissa didn't share her decision that day. A pipe burst in the kitchen before she could finish, sending everyone scrambling for mops and buckets. By the time the plumber arrived, the staff meeting was forgotten. Talia returned home late, wet and tired. Eliza was watching a movie in the living room, a bowl of popcorn in her lap. You look like you swam home, Eliza said, patting the couch beside her. Bad day. Flood at the diner. Talia kicked off her damp shoes and collapsed next to her grandmother. But something interesting happened before that. Talia told Eliza about the letter from JD Vance. As she repeated what she could remember of his words, she noticed her grandmother's face change. A strange expression flickered across Eliza's features, something like recognition. Grandma? What is it? Eliza pressed her lips together, then slowly set aside her popcorn bowl. His grandmother, she said softly. Did he mention her name? No, just that she taught him to respond to rejection with kindness. Talia studied her grandmother's face. Why? Do you know her? Eliza stood up, steadying herself on the arm of the couch. Wait here, she said, and walked slowly to her bedroom. Talia heard drawers opening and closing. A few minutes later, Eliza returned carrying an old photo album bound in faded blue leather. She sat down and opened it carefully. I haven't looked at these in years, she murmured, turning brittle pages. Let me see. The album was filled with black and white photographs. Young women in dresses with wide collars, men in work shirts, standing next to old cars, children playing in dusty yards. Eliza stopped at a page near the middle. There, she said, pointing to a photo of two teenage girls sitting on a porch step. One was clearly a young Eliza, slim and serious-faced. The other had wild curly hair and a wide smile. That's Beverly, Eliza said, her voice soft with memory. But everyone called her Mama. Talia stared at the photo, then at her grandmother. Mama? As in JD Vance's grandmother. Yes. Eliza touched the photo gently. We grew up together in Kentucky. Best friends from the time we could walk until I moved away at 18. Talia couldn't believe what she was hearing. You knew JD Vance's grandmother? Why didn't you say anything when I told you about him coming to the diner? I wasn't sure. At first, Eliza admitted. Vance isn't her family name, and there are lots of people with tough grandmothers from Kentucky. But when you told me what he said in the letter, about responding to rejection with kindness, she smiled faintly. That was pure Beverly. She always said that. Talia looked back at the photo. The girl who would become JD's mama had a fierce look in her eyes, even as she smiled. She had one arm slung protectively around young Eliza's shoulders. What was she like? Talia asked. Eliza laughed. Oh, she was something. Tough as nails, but soft-hearted underneath. Wouldn't take nonsense from anyone. If she loved you, she'd fight tigers for you. If she didn't, Eliza shook her head. Well, you'd know it. How did you lose touch? Life, Eliza said simply. I moved away for work. She stayed. We wrote letters for a while, but you know how it is. This was long before cell phones and email. She turned another page in the album, revealing more photos of the two girls at a swimming hole, in school uniforms, decorating a Christmas tree. We came from nothing, Beverly and I, Eliza continued. Dirt poor. But she always said we'd make something of ourselves. Her voice grew distant. I became a nurse. Eliza paused. Well, she raised a family. From what I've heard, it wasn't always easy for her. Talia remembered snippets she'd read online about JD Vance's childhood, about growing up poor in Ohio with his grandmother as his rock. And now her grandson is famous, Talia mused, and somehow ended up in our little town, at Melissa's diner. Life is full of circles, Eliza said. She closed the album and set it on the coffee table. I should have recognized him if he looks anything like her family. Would you want to meet him? Talia asked. I could tell Melissa. Maybe she'd... Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Eliza interrupted. Melissa has her own decision to make first. She picked up her popcorn bowl again. But yes, I think I would like to meet Beverly's grandson, to see what kind of man she raised. That night, Talia lay awake thinking about circles and connections. How strange that JD Vance, whose grandmother had been her own grandmother's best friend, would walk into Maple Creek Diner on that particular evening. And how strange that his response to rejection, kindness instead of anger, would be something passed down from a woman who had grown up with Eliza. It felt like more than coincidence. It felt like a story that wasn't finished yet. Talia's phone rang at 5:15 the next morning, jolting her awake. She fumbled for it in the dark, knocking over a glass of water in the process. Hello? She croaked. Talia, it's Melissa. I need you to come in early. Talia sat up, suddenly alert. Is everything okay? Is it the pipe again? No, nothing like that. I need to talk to you. About what I was going to tell everyone yesterday before the flood. Melissa sounded different. Her usual sharp tone was gone, replaced by something softer. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Talia promised. She dressed quickly in the dark and peeked in on Eliza, who was still sleeping. On the coffee table lay the photo album, a bookmark placed at the page with the picture of young Eliza and Mama. The streets were empty as Talia walked to the diner. The sky was turning from black to deep blue, with just a hint of pink at the horizon. A single car passed her, its headlights briefly illuminating the storefronts she knew by heart. When she reached Maple Creek Diner, the lights were already on. Through the window, she could see Melissa sitting alone at the counter, a mug of coffee in front of her. Talia knocked lightly on the glass. Melissa looked up and waved her in. Thanks for coming, Melissa said as Talia entered. Coffee? Please. Talia hung up her jacket and sat on the stool next to Melissa. The diner felt strange when empty, bigger and quieter, like a theater after the audience has left. Melissa poured coffee into a clean mug and slid it toward Talia. I couldn't sleep last night, she admitted. I kept thinking about that letter, about what to do next. And? Talia asked, wrapping her cold hands around the warm mug. I'm going to invite him back, Melissa said simply. JD Vance. I'm going to invite him to eat here. Talia nearly spilled her coffee. Really? Melissa nodded. I've been unfair. I judged him based on politics without knowing him as a person. She traced the rim of her mug with one finger. My dad always said, strong people can admit when they're wrong. I think I was wrong, Talia. Talia didn't know what to say. The Melissa she'd worked for these past 2 years rarely admitted to being wrong about anything. not about recipes, not about schedules, and certainly not about deeply held beliefs. "I think that's brave," Talia said finally. "It doesn't feel brave. It feels scary." Melissa's voice was quiet. "What if it's a mistake? What if he uses it against me somehow?" "From his letter. That doesn't sound like something he'd do." "No, it doesn't." Melissa took a sip of her coffee. "That's why I wanted to talk to you first. I value your opinion, and I need your help writing the invitation. I'm not good with words like that." Talia felt honored that Melissa would ask for her help. As they discussed what to say in the invitation, she debated whether to share what she had learned from Eliza. Would knowing about the connection make Melissa more or less comfortable with inviting JD? "There's something I should tell you," Talia said finally. "Something kind of amazing, actually." She told Melissa about Eliza's revelation, that she and JD's grandmother had been childhood friends. As she spoke, Melissa's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" Melissa interrupted. "Your grandmother actually knew his grandmother? They were friends?" Talia nodded. "Best friends until my grandma moved away. She has photos and everything." Melissa set down her mug hard enough to slosh coffee onto the counter. That's incredible. It's like fate?" Talia suggested. "I was going to say weird coincidence, but yeah, maybe fate." Melissa wiped up the spilled coffee with a napkin. "Does your grandmother want to meet him?" "I think she'd like that," Talia said carefully. "If you're okay with it." Melissa was quiet for a moment, thinking, what if we invite both of them? JD and your grandmother? Make it a real conversation, not just an apology dinner. Her eyes brightened with the idea. It would be private, after hours, just the four of us. "Four? You and me," Melissa clarified. "You should be there for your grandmother, and I—" She hesitated. "I might need the moral support." Talia smiled. "I think that sounds perfect." They spent the next hour drafting the invitation. Melissa wanted it handwritten, like JD's letter had been. They went through several versions before settling on one that felt right. Respectful, but not overly formal. Apologetic, but not groveling. Dear Mr. Vance, JD, thank you for your letter. Your kindness in the face of my rejection has made me reconsider many things. I would like to invite you to dinner at Maple Creek Diner on Friday evening at 7 p.m. after we close to the public. I'd like to apologize in person and offer you the meal you were denied. There's also something remarkable I've discovered. My waitress, Talia's grandmother, Eliza Reynolds, believes she was childhood friends with your grandmother in Kentucky. She has photographs and memories she'd like to share, if you're interested. This is not a publicity event. No press, no cameras, just a chance to talk as people, not politics. Sincerely, Melissa Hargrove. Melissa sealed the letter in one of the diner's good envelopes and wrote JD's name on the front. How do we even get this to him? She wondered aloud. I can help with that, Talia offered. Camden Walsh, that reporter who keeps coming in, he mentioned he was covering JD's visit to the community college tomorrow. I could ask him to deliver it. Melissa looked uncertain. Can we trust a reporter to deliver a private letter without making a story out of it? I think so. He's been fair in his coverage so far. By the time they finished, the morning staff had begun to arrive. The routine of the diner took over. Brewing, coffee, mixing batter, taking the chairs off the tables. But something had changed. Melissa moved differently, smiled more easily. The weight of anger she'd carried seemed lighter. As Talia tied on her apron to start the morning shift, Melissa called her name. Do you think he'll come? She asked, suddenly looking vulnerable. I do, Talia said with certainty. From everything we've seen, he seems like someone who believes in second chances. Melissa nodded, squared her shoulders, and turned to greet the first customers of the day. But before she did, Talia heard her whisper, "I hope you're right." Camden Walsh agreed to deliver the letter. He promised Talia he wouldn't make it a story, though his curious eyes suggested it was a promise he found difficult to keep. 2 days later, Melissa received a text message from a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Hargrove, this is JD Vance. Thank you for your invitation. I would be honored to join you on Friday at 7:08. Sadidurkis, the connection to my grandmother is especially meaningful. To me, may I bring dessert?" Melissa read the text to Talia with shaking hands. "He said yes," she kept repeating. "He's actually coming. And he's bringing dessert," Talia added with a smile. "That's a good sign." Planning for Friday evening quickly took over the diner. Melissa decided to create a special menu showcasing her best dishes. She tested 3 different meatloaf recipes before settling on one with a maple glaze that made even Hector, her pickiest cook, ask for seconds. "Nothing too fancy," she insisted as they planned. "I want it to feel like a real diner meal, just the best version possible." Talia brought Eliza in to meet Melissa on Wednesday. The 2 women sat in a corner booth for nearly an hour, looking through Eliza's photo album and talking about what Eliza remembered of Beverly Mama Vance. "She was the bravest person I knew," Eliza told Melissa. "When we were 12, some boys were throwing rocks at a stray dog. Beverly marched right up to them, all 4 of them, bigger than us, and told them if they threw one more rock, she'd make sure they regretted it for the rest of their lives." Eliza laughed at the memory. "They ran off like she was twice her size. That's the kind of person she was." Talia watched Melissa absorb these stories, saw something soften in her face. It was harder to see someone as an enemy when you could picture their grandmother protecting a stray dog. At home, Eliza fretted over what to wear. "It's not a fancy dinner, Grandma," Talia assured her. "Just wear something comfortable." "I want to look nice," Eliza insisted. "For Beverly's sake." They settled on a blue dress that brought out Eliza's eyes, with a cardigan in case the diner was chilly. Eliza polished her good shoes and found a small silver pin that Beverly had given her for her 16th birthday. "I haven't worn this in years," she said, fastening it to her collar. "But he might recognize it. It was a family piece." Word got around town that something was happening at the diner on Friday night. Melissa's staff kept quiet about the details, but rumors spread anyway. Some people guessed that JD was coming back. Others that a food critic was visiting. On Thursday afternoon, Camden Walsh showed up at the diner during Talia's shift. "Is it true?" he asked eagerly, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Is JD Vance having dinner here tomorrow night?" Talia gave him a stern look. "You promised not to make it a story." "I haven't," Camden protested. "But I'm not the only reporter in town, you know. People are talking." Melissa emerged from the kitchen when she heard Camden's voice. "Mr. Walsh," she said coolly, "can I help you with something?" Camden had the grace to look embarrassed. "I was just checking if you needed anything for tomorrow, since I helped with the invitation and all." Melissa's face softened slightly. "I appreciate your help truly, but this isn't a media event. It's a private dinner." Of course. Camden nodded, but he looked disappointed. "It's just such a great story. 2 sides coming together, finding common ground. People need to hear about things like that these days." "Maybe," Melissa allowed, "but not yet. This needs to be real, not a performance for cameras." Camden left without arguing further, but Talia worried. If other reporters got wind of the dinner, they might not be as understanding. Friday morning dawned clear and crisp. Melissa came in before dawn to start preparing, even though the diner wouldn't close until 6 m, giving them only an hour to get ready for JD's arrival. Talia arrived at noon for her shift and found the kitchen in organized chaos. Every surface was covered with food prep. Melissa had made rolls from scratch, and the smell of baking bread filled the air. "It's just dinner," Talia reassured her boss, "not a state banquet." I know," Melissa said, wiping flour from her cheek. "But I want it to be perfect." The day passed in a blur of customers and preparations. At 5:30, Talia called Eliza to make sure she was ready. Hector had volunteered to pick her up on his way back to the diner. At exactly 6 hours, Melissa flipped the sign on the door to "closed" and locked it. The staff quickly cleared and reset the best table, near the window but not directly visible from the street. Melissa had found a tablecloth and cloth napkins, small, luxuries the diner normally didn't use. "What if it's awkward?" Melissa asked suddenly, pausing in the middle of arranging silverware. "What if we have nothing to say to each other?" "You'll have plenty to talk about," Talia assured her. "Between the diner, politics, and his grandmother, I think the problem will be fitting it all into one dinner." At 6:30, Eliza arrived with Hector. She looked lovely in her blue dress, her white hair neatly styled, the silver pin gleaming at her collar. She carried the photo album carefully wrapped in a cloth bag. "You look beautiful, Grandma," Talia said, hugging her gently. Eliza smoothed her dress nervously. "Do you think he'll see any resemblance to the girl in those photos? It was so long ago." "He'll see it," Talia said confidently. At 6:55, they were all ready. The table was set, the food was keeping warm, and soft music played from the diner's old radio. Melissa had changed into a simple black dress, but kept her diner apron on, a touch that made Talia smile. Some things didn't change. They heard a car pull up outside. Melissa took a deep breath. "Here we go," she whispered. The knock on the door was soft but clear. Melissa smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and walked across the diner floor. Her hand hesitated on the lock for just a moment before she turned it and pulled the door open. JD Vance stood on the doorstep, a bakery box tied with string in his hands. He wore a blue button-down shirt and khaki pants, casual but neat. His smile was tentative. "Ms. Hargrove," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for inviting me." Melissa shook his hand. "Please, call me Melissa, and thank you for coming." She stepped back to let him enter. "Especially after, well, last time." "Water, under the bridge," JD said easily, stepping inside. Talia watched from beside the table where Eliza sat. This was the first time she'd really looked at JD. The first night had been such a blur, and she'd been too busy to pay attention. He was taller than she remembered, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "I brought pie," JD said, holding up the bakery box. "Apple, from that little bakery on Elm Street. The owner said it was the best in town." "Betty's Bakery," Melissa nodded. "She doesn't exaggerate. Her pies win ribbons at the county fair every year." The moment felt surreal to Talia. 2 weeks ago, Melissa had refused to serve JD Vance a cup of coffee. Now they were chatting about pie like old friends. "Let me introduce you," Melissa said, guiding JD toward the table. "This is Talia Reynolds, my best waitress." She winked at Talia. "She's also the one who convinced me to rethink some things." JD shook Talia's hand. "Nice to officially meet you." "And this," Melissa continued, "is Eliza Reynolds, Talia's grandmother." JD turned to Eliza, who was sitting very straight in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. The moment he saw her, something changed in his face. He went very still, his eyes widening slightly. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said softly. Eliza smiled, her eyes suddenly bright with tears. "You look just like your Uncle Jimmy," she said. "Beverly's brother, same eyes." JD put the pie box down on a nearby table and moved closer to Eliza. "You really knew my grandmother? When she was young?" Eliza nodded and patted the chair next to her. "Sit down, young man. I have some stories to tell you." As JD sat, Eliza opened the photo album in front of her. "This is where it starts," she said, pointing to the picture of the two girls on the porch steps. JD leaned forward, his breath catching. "Mama," he whispered, touching the image of the wild-haired girl with the fierce smile. "I've never seen a picture of her this young." "Wait, we're 14 when this was taken," Eliza explained. "Your great-grandfather took it right before he left for work at the steel mill. It was a Sunday." She turned the page. "And this one was from the swimming hole where we spent every summer day we could escape our chores." Talia and Melissa exchanged a glance, both feeling like they were witnessing something special. Melissa motioned toward the kitchen, and Talia followed her. "Let's give them a few minutes," Melissa said, checking on the food. "This is more important than dinner getting cold." They busied themselves in the kitchen, listening to the murmur of voices from the dining room. Occasionally, they heard JD laugh or Eliza exclaim, "That's right! I'd forgotten that part." After about 15 minutes, Melissa peeked out. JD and Eliza were still looking at photos, but they had reached the end of the album. It seemed like a good time to serve dinner. "Everything's ready," she announced, bringing out a platter of meatloaf, sliced thick and glistening with maple glaze. Talia followed with bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans with bacon. "This looks amazing," JD said, helping Eliza close the photo album carefully. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal like this in weeks." They settled around the table, and an awkward moment hung in the air before Eliza quietly bowed her head. Taking the cue, the others did the same as she offered a simple blessing for the food and the company. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than any of them had expected. JD told stories about his grandmother that made Eliza nod in recognition. She was exactly the same as a grown woman, Eliza confirmed. Loyal to a fault and tough as nails, but so tender-hearted underneath. "That's her," JD agreed. "She saved my life, really. Gave me stability when everything else was chaos." He looked at Eliza. "Did you know she kept your high school graduation picture in her Bible until the day she died? I found it when we cleaned out her house. I didn't know who you were then." Eliza pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears again. "I had no idea she kept track of me." "She did," JD said gently. "She had newspaper clippings too. When you got your nursing degree, when you won that community service award in 1987. "My stars," Eliza whispered. "All those years, I thought she'd forgotten me. She never did." The meal continued, the food just an excuse to keep talking. Melissa's awkwardness gradually faded as she watched JD listen intently to Eliza's stories. Whatever she had expected from this dinner, it wasn't the genuine warmth she witnessed. Eventually, the conversation turned to JD's visit to the diner 2 weeks earlier. "I owe you an apology," Melissa said, setting down her fork. "I judged you unfairly. I didn't give you a chance." JD shook his head. "Everyone has the right to their opinions." "Opinions, yes, but not to be unkind." Melissa fidgeted with her napkin. "My parents lost their farm during the recession. Dad blamed politicians with certain views. When he died 3 years ago, I promised him I'd never support those policies." She looked up at JD. but that doesn't excuse how I treated you." "I understand more than you might think," JD said. "I grew up watching good people lose everything. Jobs, homes, hope. That's why I got into politics in the first place." He smiled slightly. "We probably agree on more than we disagree on, if we're both trying to help people who are struggling." Talia watched her boss nod slowly, considering his words. The tension that had lived in Melissa's shoulders for as long as Talia had known her seemed to ease slightly. After dinner, they served the apple pie with vanilla ice cream. JD insisted on clearing the plates, despite Melissa's protests. As they ate dessert, the conversation shifted to lighter topics: favorite books, movies, the best fishing spots in the county. When Eliza stifled a yawn, Talia realized it was almost 10 o'clock. "I should get Grandma home," she said reluctantly. JD stood immediately. "Of course, it's getting late." He turned to Eliza and took her hand. "Mrs. Reynolds, meeting you has been..." He seemed to search for the right word. "A gift. Like finding a piece of my grandmother I didn't know was missing." Eliza patted his cheek. "You're a good boy. Beverly would be proud of the man you've become." She pressed the photo album into his hands. "Take this. I made copies of the pictures years ago. She would want you to have the originals." JD protested, but Eliza insisted. Finally, he accepted the album, handling it like a precious artifact. As they gathered their things, Melissa pulled Talia aside. "Would you mind if JD and I talked for a few more minutes? There's something I want to discuss with him privately." Talia nodded, curious but not wanting to pry. She helped Eliza with her cardigan and watched as JD shook hands with Melissa. "Thank you for tonight," he said. "Best meal I've had in years." Melissa smiled, more genuinely than Talia had ever seen. "Next time you're in town, the door's open. No invitation needed." As Talia and Eliza stepped outside, Talia glanced back through the window. JD and Melissa had returned to the table and were talking intently, their conversation continuing even as the rest of the diner grew dark around them. "That went well," Eliza said as they walked to Talia's car. "Better than anyone expected, I think." Talia wondered what Melissa and JD were discussing. What else could there be to say after such an evening? She would find out soon enough. But for now, she was content knowing that one small bridge had been built across a wide divide. And maybe that was enough for one night. Talia didn't ask Melissa about her private conversation with JD. She figured her boss would share when she was ready. For the next 3 days, Melissa seemed distracted, often staring into space with a small frown on her face. When Talia asked if everything was okay, Melissa just nodded and said she had a lot to think about. On Wednesday morning, Melissa called a staff meeting before opening. The entire team gathered around the pushed-together tables where they had sat for the previous meeting, the one interrupted by the burst pipe. Talia noticed that Melissa had brought in donuts and coffee from Betty's bakery. A rare treat. "I have some news," Melissa began once everyone had settled. "And I wanted you all to hear it from me first, before rumors start flying." The staff exchanged nervous glances. In a small town like theirs, news from the boss could mean many things, few of them good. Was the diner closing? Was Melissa selling? "As tea, you know," Melissa continued. "Business has been better since JD Vance's post about us. But even with the increase in customers, we've been struggling financially for a long time." Melissa took a deep breath. "Last month, before all this happened, I applied for a small business loan to renovate the kitchen and expand our hours. I was turned down." She looked around at her staff. "Our profit margins were too small, and the bank didn't think we were a good risk?" Talia felt her stomach tighten. This sounded like the beginning of a closure announcement. "But something has changed," Melissa said, her voice brightening. And this is where the story gets unexpected. She pulled an envelope from her apron pocket. Not the cream-colored one from JD, but a crisp white business envelope with a logo Talia didn't recognize. "After our dinner on Friday night, JD Vance told me something surprising," Melissa said. "The night I turned him away from the diner? After he left, he made a phone call from his car." Talia leaned forward. She remembered seeing JD sitting in his car that night, talking on his phone. She had assumed he was complaining to someone about being kicked out. "That call," Melissa continued, "was to a friend of his who runs a small business investment fund. JD was already in town looking at local businesses to potentially support. Even after I turned him away, he recommended Maple Creek Diner to his friend." Murmurs rippled through the staff. This was not what anyone had expected. "This fund," Melissa held up the envelope, "invests in small businesses in struggling communities. They provide capital for expansion, renovation, better equipment, whatever is needed to help the business grow and create more jobs." She pulled a letter from the envelope. "Yesterday, I received an offer from them." The room went completely silent. "They want to invest in us," Melissa said, her voice trembling slightly. "Enough to renovate the entire kitchen, expand into the empty storefront next door, and create a proper waiting area." She smiled. No more customers standing outside in the rain while they wait for a table. Talia could hardly believe what she was hearing. The empty storefront had sat vacant for years after the hardware store closed. Combined with the diner, it would more than double their space. But wait, Danny, one of the other waitresses, spoke up. "What's the catch? Do they want to change the diner? Make it fancy or turn it into a chain?" Melissa shook her head. "That's the amazing part. They don't want any control over the business. I keep full ownership and make all the decisions. The only requirements are that we create at least 5 new jobs and provide health insurance to all full-time employees." A ripple of excitement passed through the room. Health insurance was something Melissa had wanted to offer for years, but could never afford. "So that's what he was telling you Friday night?" Talia asked. "About this investment?" "Yes," Melissa confirmed. "He wanted me to know about it privately first, to make sure I understood there were no strings attached. He won't be involved personally in the investment or the diner. He was just the one who recommended us to the fund." Hector, who rarely spoke at meetings, raised his hand. "Why would he do that? After you kicked him out?" It was the question they'd all been wondering. Melissa was quiet for a moment. "I asked him that same thing," she said finally. His answer was simple. "Because that's what my grandmother would have done." Talia thought of the stories Eliza had shared about Mama Vance, her fierce loyalty, her protective nature, her belief in second chances. It made sense. "So what happens next?" Talia asked. "If we accept the offer, renovations would start next month," Melissa explained. "We'd stay open during most of it, though we might need to close for a week when they replace the main kitchen equipment." She looked around at her staff. "It would mean changes for all of us. More hours available, more responsibility. I'd need shift supervisors, a separate manager for the expanded section." Talia could see her co-workers processing this information, eyes brightening as they realized what it could mean for their futures. "I haven't said yes yet," Melissa continued. "I wanted to talk to all of you first. This affects your lives too." "Are you kidding?" Danny burst out. "Say yes. This is what we've all been hoping for." Others nodded eagerly. Melissa had made no secret of her financial struggles over the years. They'd all worked through leaky roofs, broken air conditioning, and outdated equipment. The chance to have a renovated workspace and health insurance seemed like a dream. "I'm still processing it all, Melissa admitted. Part of me feels strange accepting help that came about because of JD Vance, like I'm compromising my principles somehow. Talia thought carefully before speaking. Grandma always says that good can come from unexpected places. Maybe this is one of those times. Besides, Hector added, surprising everyone by joining the conversation again, it's not like you're supporting his politics. You're just accepting investment in a business that feeds people and employs people. That's not political. Melissa looked around the room, taking in the hopeful faces of her staff. You're right, she said slowly. I've been overthinking this. She squared her shoulders. I'm going to accept the offer. A cheer went up from the staff. Danny hugged the waitress next to her. Hector allowed himself a rare smile. As the excitement settled, Melissa raised her hand. One more thing. If this goes through, when this goes through, I want to make some changes to how we operate. Not just the building, but our whole approach. She looked directly at Talia. Starting with our door policy. From now on, Maple Creek Diner serves everyone. No exceptions. We can disagree with people's views, but we don't turn away hungry folks. That's not who we are. Talia felt a surge of pride in her boss. The journey from that first night to this moment had been remarkable. After the meeting, as they prepared to open for the day, Talia found Melissa staring at the empty storefront next door through the window. Can you believe it? Melissa asked softly. A month ago, I was worrying about how to pay the electric bill. Now I'm planning an expansion. It's amazing, Talia agreed. Have you told your parents? She faltered, remembering that Melissa's father had passed away. I visited Mom last night, Melissa said. Told her everything. About turning JD away, about the dinner, about the investment offer. She smiled faintly. She reminded me that Dad always said businesses should bring communities together, not drive them apart. I think he would have approved of this decision. Politics aside, Talia nodded, relieved. There's one more thing JD told me that night, Melissa added, her voice thoughtful. He said the reason he was in town in the first place was to find businesses worth supporting. That our little town had been on his radar for months. Really? Why here? Because we're the kind of place that's often overlooked. Not big enough for major development, not small enough to be quaint and tourist-friendly. Just a regular town with regular people trying to get by. Melissa turned to face Talia. He said, those are the places that need investment most. The overlooked places. Talia thought about this as she filled salt shakers for the morning rush. It was strange to think that JD Vance had seen potential in their town even before the incident at the diner. That he might have ended up helping Maple Creek regardless. But then again, maybe it wasn't strange at all. Maybe, as Eliza had said, life was full of circles, and sometimes those circles connected in ways no one could predict. 6 months passed quickly. Winter turned to spring, and spring blossomed into summer. Maple Creek Diner closed for exactly 8 days in April while the main kitchen was gutted and rebuilt with gleaming new equipment. Melissa fretted the entire time, calling the contractors twice daily for updates. When the diner reopened, the change was dramatic. The wall between the original space and the empty storefront next door had been removed, nearly doubling their seating capacity. The counter had been extended, curving elegantly into the new space. Large windows let in natural light, brightening the entire restaurant. But some things remained the same. The blue and white checkered curtains still hung in the windows. The bulletin board still displayed children's drawings and community announcements, and Melissa still started each day by brewing the coffee herself, insisting no one else got the strength quite right. Talia no longer wore a waitress uniform. As assistant manager, she had her own small office, really just a desk in a corner, but she was proud of it nonetheless. The promotion had come with a substantial raise and, more importantly, health insurance that covered Eliza's heart medication. On a warm July morning, Talia arrived early to handle a delivery. As she checked the invoice against the boxes of supplies, the bell above the door jingled. She looked up to see JD Vance enter, carrying a leather briefcase. "Good morning," he greeted her with a smile. "Is that table by the window open?" It was his usual spot. Since the dinner 6 months ago, JD had visited the diner whenever he was in town, about once a month. He always sat at the same table, ordered the same breakfast, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, crispy bacon, and spent an hour or 2 working on his laptop. "All yours," Talia confirmed, returning his smile. "Coffee?" "Please." Talia brought him a mug and a carafe of fresh coffee. "Melissa's in a meeting with the new staff, but she should be out soon." "No rush," JD said, opening his briefcase. "I've got plenty of work to keep me busy." Melissa had hired 3 new waitresses and 2 cooks in the past months. The latest additions were from the local recovery center, people working to rebuild their lives after addiction. It had been Melissa's idea to partner with the center, offering jobs to those who had completed the program. By the time Melissa emerged from her meeting, the morning rush was in full swing. The diner hummed with conversation and the clinking of silverware. She stopped by JD's table on her way to the kitchen. "The usual?" she asked. "You know me too well," he replied. Their interactions were comfortable now, the awkwardness of their first encounters long gone. They didn't always agree. Talia had overheard more than one spirited debate between them about policy issues, but the arguments were respectful, even friendly. As Talia moved between tables, refilling coffee cups and taking orders, she caught fragments of conversations. 2 construction workers discussing the new factory breaking ground on the edge of town. A group of teachers planning the back-to-school fair. A young couple excitedly sharing news about their approved mortgage for a starter home. The mood in the town had shifted since winter. There was an energy, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. The diner wasn't the only business that had changed. The fund JD had recommended had invested in 6 other small businesses in town. The hardware store had reopened with a modern tool rental section, the old movie theater was being renovated, and a vacant lot downtown was being transformed into a small business incubator. During a lull in the rush, Talia stopped by JD's table to refill his coffee. "How's your grandmother?" he asked. "I've been meaning to visit her again." "She'd love that," Talia said. "She's doing really well. Her doctor says her heart is stronger than it's been in years." "Good to hear. My offer still stands if she ever wants to record her memories of my grandmother. My family would treasure that." Talia nodded. "I'll remind her." As she turned to go, JD added, "By the way, that college scholarship program we discussed, it's happening. The first applications will be accepted this fall. Make sure you apply." Talia's face brightened. "Really? That's wonderful news." "You've earned it," JD said simply. Later, as the lunch crowd thinned, Talia watched Melissa chatting with JD as he paid his bill. There was no tension between them now, no trace of the anger that had led Melissa to turn him away that first night. "Penny for your thoughts?" Eliza's voice broke into Talia's reflections. Her grandmother had taken to visiting the diner several times a week, sitting at her own special table where she would knit and chat with customers. "I was just thinking about how much has changed," Talia admitted, sitting down across from her grandmother. "Not just the diner, but the whole town. All because of one moment that could have gone so differently." Eliza nodded wisely. Life turns on small moments, dear. The choices we make when we're hurt or angry can lead us down very different paths. They both watched as JD shook Melissa's hand and headed for the door, stopping to greet several regular customers on his way. He had become a familiar face in their town, not as a politician, but as a person. "Do you know what I think is the most shocking thing JD did?" Eliza asked, her eyes twinkling. "What's that?" "He showed that people with different views can still treat each other with dignity, can still find common ground." Eliza's hands stilled on her knitting. In times like these, that's nothing short of revolutionary. Talia considered her grandmother's words as she watched JD drive away. The most shocking thing hadn't been the social media post or the investment fund. It hadn't even been his forgiveness of Melissa's rejection. The most shocking thing had been the bridge he built, a way for people to walk toward each other instead of turning away. A simple choice that had changed everything. As Talia returned to work, she realized that maybe that was the lesson in all of this. That bridges could be built by anyone, anywhere, with nothing more than a decision to respond to rejection with kindness. And in a world so easily divided, perhaps that was the most shocking revelation of all. As our story of JD Vance and the Maple Creek Diner comes to a close, I'm curious, where are you listening from today? Whether you're from a small town like the one in our story or a bustling city, kindness can bridge divides anywhere. If this message of responding to rejection with compassion resonated with you, please hit that like button to help spread this story of unexpected kindness. And don't miss our next inspiring story. It's appearing on your screen right now. Just click to discover another moment where someone chose understanding over division in today's challenging world. Remember, the most revolutionary act might just be treating others with dignity, especially when we disagree.